Good morning and welcome. My name is Somiah Handy and I'm the Small Business Manager here at San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for attending today's Small Business Help Desk. The Small Business Help Desk will be an ongoing series each month. We'll be hosting different topics that we feel are vital to the growth, support, and success to the small business community. Today's topic is the legalities of vaccinations and mask wearing in the workplace. We're happy to have one of our board members, Jason Geller from Fisher & Phillips Law Firm, to present today. I also want to give a special thank you to our Small Business Help Desk sponsor, Redwood Credit Union. Today, we will be hearing a presentation from Jason. After the presentation, there will be time for a live Q&A. If you have any questions at all during the program, please feel free to place it in the chat. Also, please note that this webinar will be recorded and uploaded to San Francisco Chamber's YouTube channel, along with all our other webinars and virtual events for over the past year and a half. With that said, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Jason Geller. Jason is a regional managing partner of Fisher Phillips at the San Francisco office. He represents and counsels employers in all aspects of labor and employment law, including employment discrimination, wrongful termination, harassment, retaliation, wage hour class action lawsuits, employment handbook and personal policy preparation, and general preventive advice. Again, thank you so much, Jason, for joining us. And with that, I pass it on to you.
Somiah, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen here with the slides. Let's see if I'm successful. And it appears that I've managed to do it. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thanks again, Somiah and Rodney and the team at the Chamber for having me this morning. I'm a proud member of the Board of Directors of the Chamber, and I'm happy to discuss today issues about vaccines in employment. As Somiah mentioned, we're going to have a time for a Q&A if there are any questions afterwards. My goal is to go through the slide deck over the next roughly half hour and then leave plenty of time for questions afterwards as is necessary. Although whenever I've been known to make overpromise and underdeliver on my time estimates, so I'll try to keep it brief. So let's, and as Somiah mentioned, all I do is represent employers in workplace matters. I represent a lot of small businesses, for-profits, nonprofits in different industries from hospitality to manufacturing. So I've got a pretty broad experience of dealing with employers in all areas, but in particular in the COVID era, and what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing from clients, I'll hopefully bring that to bear during our discussion. And then I also litigate. So I'm a trial lawyer and I go into court a lot. So I've kind of got that perspective as well. And hopefully today we'll talk about some issues that will be preventative so that we can protect our employees on the one hand, and on the other, of course, avoid the courthouse, which is something we all want to do. So in terms of kind of the agenda, I'm going to cover, as I said on the slide, these main topics, and things are very fluid right now, as we're going to talk about. The mayor making an important announcement this morning about potential vaccine mandates, broader than what we've already seen. So we really, in general, have to have our fingers on the pulse, so to speak, about what's going on locally and at the state level, because things are changing on often a weekly or sometimes a daily basis. So if you're not doing this already, you should be checking the California Department of Public Health and the San Francisco Department of Public Health websites, the city's website, for updates in these critical areas. So I'm going to start off with talking about the vaccines and what our options are from an employer's perspective in terms of requiring vaccines. And we've got different options, obviously. some clients, and I would say we've conducted a survey of, this was maybe a month and a half ago, a survey of many of our clients and non-clients about what are we doing with vaccines. Are companies requiring vaccines, assuming that it's not legally required, or are they instead taking more of a hands-off approach? What is going on? I would say that overwhelmingly, most of the clients we've been surveying are not requiring vaccines. Option number 3, of course, unless it's legally mandated. More about that shortly. Most are encouraging employees to get vaccinated, both through policies and education, where there might be a statement from the employer saying, hey, look, we're not forcing you to do this, but there are a lot of good reasons to get vaccinated. Here is some educational material for you to review and get up to speed on why you should do it. And it's safe for our workplace. So a lot of education. I think the survey determined that only about 9% of the employers we talked to were requiring it. Now, the hybrid approach, I'm going to talk about this, is whether you want to give some kind of incentive. And by that, I mean some kind of perk. Hey, we're going to give you a membership to the GGRA if you sign up, or if you get vaccinated, or we're going to give you a gift card, or we'll give you more time off at the more PTO or vacation, or other types of incentives. So we are seeing that, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of offering incentives, because it can open you up to different problems if you're not aware of what you're doing, and it's very easy to kind of step in a minefield there if you don't appreciate the consequences of incentives. And as I mentioned down below, legal mandates. We'll talk about the Safer Return Together order in San Francisco that came out August 2nd, and it was amended August 6th, and now it looks like we're going to get another amendment today, based on what we just heard literally before we got on this webinar, that the mayor, and many of you have seen the Chronicle post, she is going to be having a press conference later, and an updated order that is going to likely impact hospitality employers, gyms, and maybe others. We don't know the details yet, but it will likely be some kind of vaccine mandate that will apply either to guests of those types of businesses or employees of those businesses. More to learn on that, but please be watching the news today. This is going to be critical. So let's talk about mandated vaccines. If you are considering a mandate, what are some of the pros and cons about it? And generally, I'll say as a broad statement here, you can do it. The law requires you can do it. The law requires that, or allows you to mandate vaccines now among your employees, regardless of your industry. And there are certain limits to that I'm going to talk about, including whether the employee has a sincerely held religious belief or a medical problem or disability. Those are going to be the limits around whether you can actually require somebody to be vaccinated, but you can. The other thing the law has said is that asking somebody to get vaccinated is not what I say here is a medical exam. So medical examinations, it's a legal buzzword under the Americans with Disabilities Act here, the ADA, and also under our state law. If an employer is requiring somebody to have a medical exam, then there are certain rules that need to be satisfied. And I'm not going to get into those really in any detail today, other than to say the good news is it's not to ask somebody to get vaccinated, to ask any pre-screening questions related to vaccination, to have somebody tested, to ask whether they're tested, what the outcome of the COVID test was. Those things are not considered, quote, medical exams. And the good news is you don't have to deal with all the onerous or difficult rules surrounding it. So let's talk about what are some of the limitations for an employer if you're gonna require the vaccination. So the first is potential disability discrimination issues and the need to accommodate an employee with the disability. So let me just take a brief second to just talk generally about what this means. Many of you probably know that when you have an employee who has a disability, it can be a physical disability, it can be a mental disability. In California, the definition of disability is very broad. The bar is very low in terms of whether an employee is able to show that he or she has a mental or physical disability. To give you an example, the law defines a disability as something in California, as something that a physical or mental condition that makes doing your daily life tasks, walking, reading, going to work, listening, eating, you name it, reading, that makes your daily life activities more difficult. So many conditions can meet the test of being a disability. So once an employee is disabled, and if that employee has a hard time doing the main aspects of his or her job, then you probably know the employer needs to step up and have what's called an interactive process to figure out if the employer can come up with some kind of fix or accommodation, reasonable accommodation, to help the employee do the job. That's a standing requirement in California. And by the way, I would say more than 50% of the phone calls I get from employers about how to deal with a challenging situation involve accommodating disabilities. And a lot of the litigation I defend, the court, the lawsuits I handle involve those issues. So it's very important that we appreciate what this means in the vaccine setting. And so when you have this interactive process that I mentioned here, that's a back and forth with an employee to say, hey, tell me, what is your condition? I'm not asking you the diagnosis. You can never ask the diagnosis, but tell me, how does your condition affect your ability to do the job? What kind of fixes or accommodations or assistance can I give you as your employer to help you do the job? And I have to consider all those things. And ultimately, I make a decision about whether I can give the accommodation or not. So in this context, it's going to mean, what do we deal with, or how do we deal with that interactive discussion when somebody says to you, I can't be vaccinated because I've got a mental condition. I've got anxiety and a panic attack disorder. I can't wear a mask. I can't get vaccinated. I freak out when I have a shot. I've got PTSD, whatever. How do you deal with it? So I'm going to talk about that in a second. The other exception to the mandatory vaccination requirement, remember, we're talking now about you requiring that somebody be vaccinated to work in your business, is a sincerely held religious belief. We're going to talk about that shortly. It works in a lot of ways in the same manner. If they've got a religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated, if they have a religious belief that prevents them, as another example, from working on Saturdays, for example, the employer has an obligation to step up and try to figure out if they can accommodate that religious belief. Now, in the context of vaccines, same deal. Can we accommodate that religious belief and allow you to be exempt or not covered by our mandatory vaccination policy. So this is where the rubber hits the road, folks, if you're going to have a mandatory vaccination policy. So let's drill down on that a little bit more on physical disabilities. We'll cover religion in a minute. So an exemption is if they have and I say ADA or state law, California law, covered disability or other medical circumstance. So they may not have a physical disability, but what the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the DFEH, which is the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, these guys are the federal and state anti-discrimination agencies that enforce the anti-discrimination rules. And what they have said is you got to consider medical circumstances and disabilities if you're going to, potentially to allow somebody to be exempted from a mandatory vaccination policy. And one point I want to mention here is what I've underlined, documented. When an employee comes to you and says, I've got a physical disability, I can't be vaccinated, you're going to want to make sure when you have this interactive discussion that it's clearly documented, because ultimately, and this is important both to protect the employee and also to mitigate or reduce our risks of litigation, you may ultimately say, you know, Jason, we appreciate you've got your disability. We can't allow you to continue to work here without being vaccinated. We have a mandatory vaccination policy. I know you've asked us to telework, but you know, we're a restaurant and you can't serve tables from your living room, Jason. You got to be in the restaurant working. And so we're going to have to end the relationship unless you are able to get vaccinated. If you ultimately reach that conclusion, as an example, you're going to want to make sure you've had a very appropriate and thorough discussion with the employee. You've documented this so that you can rely on that later, God forbid, if you end up getting into a legal dispute later. And it's also important because you're having a transparent and prompt and fair discussion with the employee on these topics, which is what she or he is entitled to under the law. And so when I say here, demonstrate the consideration of a possible reasonable accommodation, I mean that the law says that the employer is required to have a prompt and good faith interactive discussion on these issues. And what that means and what you will need to show, it means what it says, right? Prompt, and you're doing it honestly, and you want to try to work with the person if you can. What it means is that you're going to want to show that you check the boxes on that, and you are able to demonstrate that you in good faith honestly considered what the employee wanted. At the end of the day, in any reasonable accommodation situation, you as the employer gets to decide what that accommodation is going to be and whether you can do it. All along, though, keeping in mind that you've considered what the employee wants and you've ultimately evaluated it and decided in which direction you're going to go. I hope that makes sense, because this is a big piece of mitigating litigation risk is how you handle the inquiry by the employee, how you handle the response. Because I always tell employers, there are a lot of things you cannot control. You can't control what employees say, what they do, weird things that happen. Lord knows, you know, in my business, we say you can't make it up. And that's, nothing is truer than that. People do dumb things. What you can control as an employer, though, is how you deal with it and how you respond. And that's why this piece here, the demonstration of your interactive process, is critical. So certainly the law prohibits discrimination, and I already mentioned that it limits our rights to the extent we're conducting a medical exam. It's got to be consistent, job related and consistent with business necessity. Now, as I mentioned earlier, fortunately, so far, the EEOC and the DFEH have said requiring somebody to be vaccinated, requiring them to get tested, et cetera, is not a medical exam. So we don't have to spend really much time right now on this, what it means to be consistent with business necessity and to be job related. But I do want to mention one piece about privacy in case I don't mention it later. If you are asking for documentation about a vaccination status, and I'm going to hit on that shortly, and if you are protected or not protected, covered by the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, you may not, because most of you are smaller businesses that have fewer than 25 million in revenue, but you never know. Hey, maybe we've got folks who are killing it. There are other criteria, but that's one that I run across a lot. If you have 25 million or more in annual revenue, you're covered by the CCPA, and you're required to give employees a certain notice, a written notice. My firm drafts them all the time. We deal with this all the time. You got to give them yet another form before you ask for documentation related to their vaccination status. So just know that if you're covered by the CCPA, you will need to give a CCPA notice. Now, normally, I mean, and I obviously I'm no doctor, although my mother-in-law says I pretend to be. What I'm told by most medical professionals is that there are very few medical conditions that preclude people from getting vaccinated. But nevertheless, I mean, that's something that you'll have to determine in the interactive process. I'll give you an example briefly. I have a client right now who is interacting with an employee who refused to comply with the mandatory vaccination policy. He went to his doctor. The doctor in black and white said, this employee does not have a medical condition that precludes vaccination. So you're going to have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. You may have a doctor that says to the contrary. I'm just saying that what I'm hearing anecdotally is that there are very few disabilities that preclude vaccination, but you'll have to address that on a case-by-case basis. Now, where the money is here, the money question is, can you exclude somebody who refuses to be vaccinated under your vaccination policy? And like I said, you're going to have to make that evaluation. But the three main reasons why you could say to somebody that they are precluded from working because you've interacted with them, they've got a disability, they've said I can't be vaccinated. Direct threat is a defense that employers raise to say, listen, Jason, if I allowed you to come into work without a vaccination, we work in a restaurant, we're working closely together, there's a high risk of contamination, we've had an outbreak in the past. These are objective arguments that I'm making. I'm not speculating. We've seen this. I can't have you come in because you would create a direct threat to the health and safety of our workforce. If you've got those facts, that would be something you would rely on. The other standard or defense that we're seeing a lot is this qualification standard. And what this basically means is that there's some legitimate public safety requirement in the job. And that if I were to allow you, Jason, to come into work without a vaccination, it's going to jeopardize the public. Now, don't jump up and down because that's not every business, and you've got to be careful about this. Examples might be certainly retail establishments, I would argue, might meet this standard where you're having a lot of people in the public coming in closed areas, health and safety places like obviously hospitals, schools we know are mandated anyway now in California to have a vaccination requirement, but those are the types of high risk type environments. Senior care facilities probably don't have any of those folks on the line that could meet this. But this is another basis for you to say that we could preclude somebody from working if they're not vaccinated. Now, the third reason why you would argue that I can't have you is if I gave that example of the server who says, hey, listen, can I telework? And the question that raises is on-site work an essential job function? And what that, under the disability rules, you always look at, well, can the person do the main parts of the job? And obviously in that easy example, you cannot be a server from your living room. And so that answer is easy. But what about the situation where somebody legitimately could telework? They're unvaccinated, but they could get the job done at home. You're going to need to do that evaluation and decide whether you're going to provide that accommodation. And we're getting this a lot of questions from clients in the COVID era, when we all know a lot of us have been teleworking for months now. Why can't you continue to do it? The good news is, from an employer's perspective, that doesn't mean it's always a green light that employees can always telework and can always claim that you don't have to be working on site to do the job. But it really is a case-by-case evaluation. So those are the three reasons when you might be able to tell somebody, sorry, we're going to have to part ways if you can't be vaccinated. So proof of vaccination. So here, one thing that's important to note is that you can certainly ask for proof of vaccination. That's required under the Cal-OSHA emergency temporary standard. The key that we need to avoid is, as I said on the slide, asking too much, soliciting information beyond, are you vaccinated or aren't you? Give me proof of vaccination if that's your policy, or sign a statement that you're vaccinated. More about that briefly in a minute. The key here is to not ask for too much information, like genetic information and other things the person may be doing or related to their medical situation. Employees like to talk in this environment. We want to just make it really clear, hey, I just need to know if you're vaccinated. I'm not asking about anything else. Please don't share anything else with me besides the answer to that question. Yes, no, or I refuse. Now, pre-screening questions. I'm not going to spend much time on this other than to say, look, if you are doing the vaccination, I'm sure few of us are. I don't know any employers, smaller employers who are actually administering the vaccinations themselves. If you are, then there are certain rules on pre-screening questions that you need to be concerned about. The limitations on what you can ask about before you vaccinate or require vaccination don't come into play if you have a voluntary vaccination policy. Right now, I've been talking about mandatory vaccination policies, or if you decide, or if the employee is getting a vaccinated by a third party that's not controlled by you. You know, like you're not contracting a third party. Hey, just stand in line and our vendor will go ahead and get you vaxxed up, okay? If you're not doing that, then you really don't have to worry much about pre-screening questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Now let's shift a bit to religious accommodations. So as I mentioned earlier, like accommodating disabled employees, we also have to accommodate people with sincerely held religious beliefs. Now I get this question a lot about, well, what the heck is a sincerely held religious belief? And I can tell you, and I'll give you some broad kind of guidelines on this. Number one is it doesn't have to be a traditional religion. It can be a religion that you've never heard of. And I'm joking, sort of, I'm facetious, but there are a bunch of court cases involving, I think it's called the Church of the Spaghetti Monster. I kid you not, about whether you could have a sincerely held belief if you're a member of the Church of the Spaghetti Monster. I like pasta. I'm a believer in this faith, and I'm going to join it. That could be considered a sincerely held religious belief. It doesn't have to be a traditional religion. It doesn't have to be part of a formal congregation. The standard is very, very broad, and basically it has to deal with, and I think the way the laws define it are ultimate ideas about life, purpose, and death. That's what it has to concern. Oh, great, Jason, that's super specific and easy to follow. And you're right, it ain't. And courts in general, if they're looking at it, they're going to side in favor of finding that it's a sincerely held belief. So what I'm telling you is, if you have a situation where somebody tells you they've got this belief, be conservative in terms of whether you're going to accommodate or not. I mean, err on the side of concluding that, yeah, it's probably sincerely held. I'm going to look to see if it can be accommodated. And if it can't, and then I come back to, remember I said the 3 issues: direct threat to health and safety, your business has safety requirements because you're dealing with the public, it's a matter of public safety, it's a high risk. Or number 3, you can't do that. We can't provide an accommodation that will not allow you to work in the environment with other people. And for those reasons, we can't allow the relationship. We got to terminate because we can't accommodate you. Before you make that call, before you pull that trigger, do that analysis and have that back and forth with the employee, because this is an area where employees are raising a lot of concerns, a lot of threats about potential litigation. Now, let's change gears briefly and talk about voluntary policies and incentives. I mentioned this earlier. So what if you decide that you're not going to mandate it, but you want to incentivize people? Look, the easiest thing to do is, if you're not required to have a mandatory vaccination policy, is to have and the easiest and conservative thing in a lot of ways is to just strongly encourage, educate, and say, we're not requiring it, but we want to educate you about the pros of getting vaccinated, and leave it at that. I mean, that from an employer's perspective, in some ways, is the safest thing. What if you decide you want to incentivize? Let's talk about that. So the big issues with incentives is that, and the idea behind it is that if the incentive is too rich, it's too high, then you end up possibly walking yourself into having to comply with very specific rules under the ADA and EEOC wellness program rules, and they can be very complicated. And so you want to avoid it if you can. The way to avoid it is to not have a very rich incentive. And the idea behind it is, the rationale behind it, if this makes sense, is that if I'm disabled and my employer is offering a trip to Tahiti if everybody gets vaccinated, and I might feel coerced to get vaccinated, or at least coerced into disclosing my private medical information to my employer because I want to go to Tahiti. And so the EEOC and the government, the ADA and the EEOC, get concerned if employers are trying to force people to disclose medical information. So that's kind of the idea behind it. So what do you want to do here that is appropriate? Look, the EEOC has said that de minimis or minimal incentives may be okay, such as things of value of less than $25. Like, and they've used this example, I kid you not, water bottles, okay? If you give a water bottle, get vaccinated, I'll give you a water bottle with Fisher Phillips logo on it, I'm in. something like that. Now, the Biden administration rolled back that rule, or new administrations typically want to roll back rules and then reintroduce their own. I don't know the status of that, whether it got reintroduced. Regardless, you know where the EEOC is thinking on this. So if you have a very low incentive, a low value gift card, that should be okay. Another thing you could consider, we'll give you an extra day of PTO or an extra 6 hours of vacation, and you offer that to everybody. And you say, listen, if everybody, we're going to give everybody an extra 6 hours of PTO. You can use it to get vaccinated, or you don't have to use it to get vaccinated. Something like that, that's given to everybody, not just the people who get vaccinated. That's low risk. You won't have to deal with the wellness rules. I think you could go there. On the other hand, if you start giving more money and higher value type incentives, you then run the risk of violating the wellness rules. So Baron, try to go that route. Lower risk, smaller incentives are the way to go. And make sure that it's in a published policy that's clearly defined. Now, documented vaccine status. I mentioned this earlier, and we're not going to go into the Cal OSHA emergency temporary standard in any detail right now, other than just to say, many of you probably know it, that for employees who are vaccinated under this ETS Cal OSHA rule, they do not have to be excluded from work, provided that they were fully vaccinated before they came into close contact with a COVID case. And secondly, they're asymptomatic. So that's the reason why you're under the Cal OSHA standard, you'd want to find out if somebody is vaccinated. And what you should do, and you can ask for proof of vaccination one of three ways. The easiest way under the OSHA standard is just to ask them, as I highlighted in yellow, sign a statement under penalty of perjury that they are vaccinated. That's sufficient for Cal OSHA purposes and should be for other purposes, unless, of course, we're dealing with local mandates. And I can tell you, for example, in San Francisco, under the Safer Together return order, that if you are required to be vaccinated, you have to provide proof of a vaccination with a vaccination card. So it's under that order, at least, signing an attestation, as we call it here, is not going to be sufficient. Now, if somebody decides not to tell you whether they're vaccinated or not, at least for OSHA purposes, Cal OSHA purposes, you treat them as if they are not vaccinated. So all the masking rules, now they're changed, right? I mean, a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago, vaccinated people didn't have to mask up. Now they do. But if they were exempt from masking requirements previously, now they have to wear a mask if they're unvaccinated, and you treat them for all purposes as unvaccinated if they don't want to tell you. And I've had situations where employees say that. So at this point, make sure you're updating all of your policies to account for the changing fluid environment that we're in. It's moving fast and furious. Take a look at all your COVID notices, your vaccination policies, and how you're going to address issues if you are contending with an employee who refuses to be vaccinated, or if you've got to comply with the vaccination policy or local order like we're seeing in San Francisco. I alluded to this earlier, and just note that hospitality employers are likely to be impacted by the announcement today. We'll know more later today. You can look for our legal alerts and other legal alerts on the status. I'm sure the chamber is going to be reporting very promptly on this through our public policy department. And as well as schools, of course, they are now required to have employees be vaccinated, not students, but employees, private or public. A couple brief points as I wrap up. Litigation risks. The smaller employers are getting hit with these related claims COVID type related claims. And the issues that tend to come up are wage and hour, pay practices, alleged pay practices violations, failure to comply with the leave laws, and retaliation for employees who are resisting practices that they claim are illegal, and employers are then terminating or taking other negative steps against employees. That by far is what I'm seeing are the high areas. Here on the slide, a lot of helpful resources that you can go to. Of course, the San Francisco Department of Public Health should be at the top of our list. And then other resources, my firm and other firms like mine have great resources on COVID issues. A lot of freebies on our website if you peruse it, and people say it's very user friendly. And with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to address any questions. I want to thank Somiah and Rodney and the team for having me.
Thank you, Jason, so much. You gave a wonderful presentation and really insightful information. So thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And then once I go over those, if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them also in the chat as well. One of the first questions that we have, can we ask potential employees at a job interview if they're vaccinated?
So you could, if you announce in advance that the job requirement or that you have a mandatory vaccination policy, and you ask them after the job offer has been made. So what I would not ask it before an offer is made. Post offer, that would be acceptable to ask them that this job, our policy is mandatory vaccinations, and that will be a condition of employment. You will need to provide proof of vaccination, as I mentioned earlier.
Awesome, thank you, Jason. The next question we have is, given the spike in the breakthrough cases on vaccinated people, if a vaccinated employee is at high risk, what are their options?
So if the employee is vaccinated but high risk, then that is going, and the employee then is presumably concerned about continuing to work. The fact that they are vaccinated it doesn't change what the employer's obligations are in that circumstance. There, the employer should talk to the employee about whether there's some kind of accommodation that can be had to mitigate that risk of harm to that employee, such as telework options or otherwise, and go through the interactive process that I explained before. And we dealt a lot with this before vaccinations even existed. You remember the term vulnerable population, where there was a list of people who typically fell into that category. And we often had folks say, hey, I can't work because I'm over 65 and I'm vulnerable. The employer would need to go through the interactive process to first determine, does the person have a protected disability? Again, without asking what the condition is. You can never ask what the diagnosis is. You can ask, do you have a condition that you say you're high risk, do you have a condition that affects your daily life activities? And let's say you conclude that you do, then you'll need to go through that process and see if an accommodation can be had. And if it can't, it can't.
Thank you. The next question that we have here is from Z Space. They're a performance venue. Can we turn away patrons who are not vaccinated? Do we need to provide accommodations for medical, religious exemptions? How are the vaccination mandates different from employee and non-employees?
Okay, yeah, that's a loaded question. The first I would say is this: we've got to check the local applicable health orders. As I alluded to earlier, I believe, and we'll see what I'm reading between the lines, but from what the announcement suggested, at least in San Francisco, public events may participants may be required to be vaccinated. So you got to check to see what the local orders say. Secondly, in the non-employment relationship, there is a general law called the Unruh Civil Rights Act, and that is a law that applies to private businesses that precludes discrimination against patrons of businesses open to the public. And so you always have a standing obligation to not discriminate on the basis of religion in that respect. I don't believe, and this is evolving, so I have to say to our folks at Z-Space, I don't believe at this point that you would have to do an individualized, interactive process with a patron who is not vaccinated to decide how you could let him or her enter a venue to accommodate, let's say, a religious belief. However, the caveat there is this is evolving and there may be such an obligation. But at this point, I'm not aware that you would have to do that. And you can imagine, and you would in the employment arrangement relationship, obviously. In this circumstance, I'm not so sure, but that's evolving. And I hope that answers. There were 3 parts to that. Did I miss any of that?
No, I think you hit all of it. Thank you, Jason. Another question that I had personally, a lot of fake vaccination cards have been on the internet and people have been selling them. How does an employer, if they come across that, how do they actually make sure that that vaccination card is actually valid?
So, and let me just say in general that when you're dealing with information from a doctor, let's say in a interactive process or what have you, the employer, is generally allowed to verify the credentials of the healthcare provider. You have to be very cautious in this area because there are privacy concerns and you don't want to start fishing around inadvertently into somebody's medical business, right? But the law says in the interactive process that when an employer asks for reasonable medical information, when somebody's condition is not obvious, those are the circumstances when you can ask for it. You are entitled to verify the credentials. So in this context, I think that it would be okay. You get a card, you could verify the credentials of the doctor on the vaccination card. Short of any obvious kind of information that indicates the card is fraudulent, I wouldn't press it, however, for obvious reasons, right? Because people will say you're retaliating against me, you're treating me differently. Jason gave his card and he got a free pass. When Somiah gave hers, she got, grilled on it. So you really want to be consistent. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Since we're kind of getting close to the end of the time, is there any additional questions? All right, I don't see any. So thank you, Jason, so much for joining us today. You did a wonderful job, so thank you again.
Thank you, Somiah. Appreciate you having me.
Yes. Again, I would like to do a special thank you to our sponsor, Redwood Credit Union. I'd also like to invite you guys to our upcoming events. August 24th, we have our member mixer, which will be virtual. We also have our World Conference October 7th, and we have our 30th annual EBIES, and that will be a live event on October 28th. I would like you guys to nominate. Nominations are live on our website, so please start casting your nomination. Categories include sustainability, small business, nonprofit, and excellence in business, so please nominate. Thank you so much, everyone, and if you like to check in with us, we are on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and so forth. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.